Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first Mahindra Humanities Center Writers Speak event of this spring semester. My name's Claire Massoud. I'm a senior lecturer on fiction in the English department, and I'm responsible for the Writers Speak series. We're honored and privileged to have with us today a group of extraordinary journalists for a conversation entitled Tyrants and Rebels, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The cumulative knowledge, experience, and talent gathered this afternoon is breathtaking. I want to extend our thanks to you all, Jill Abramson, Rania Abouzeid, Alyssa Rubin, and Robert Worth for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our Mahindra Humanities Center Director, Susanna Clark, and Executive Director, Steve Beal, for their support of this series. And as always, our amazing events coordinator, Mary McKinnon, without whom we would be literally nowhere. I also want to thank the Harvard Bookstore, who you will be provided with links in the chat for our presenters' books, and that is with the help of the Harvard Bookstore. So many thanks to our partners there. We have one more Writers Speak event this semester on April 12th at 6 p.m. when I'll be in conversation with two brilliant novelists, Maza Mengiste, whose recent novel, The Shadow King, was a finalist for the 2020 Booker Prize, and Namwali Serpel, whose novel, The Old Drift, has won numerous awards and will be joining us on the Harvard English Department faculty in the fall. I'd like briefly to introduce my wonderful English department colleague, Jill Abramson, who will in turn introduce our panelists. Each person will speak for about 10 minutes, and then there'll be a group conversation, after which there'll be time for audience questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A section. You'll find the link at the bottom of your screen. Jill, as many of you know, is currently senior lecturer in nonfiction here at Harvard and a beloved professor to many of our students. As you'll also know, she is a groundbreaking and vitally important journalist, the first woman editor of the New York Times newspaper. She was also the first woman to serve as Washington bureau chief and managing editor for that paper. Before the New York Times, Jill was an investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal covering money and politics. She's the author of several books, including with Jane Mayer, Strange Justice, The Selling of Clarence Thomas, and most recently, The Merchants of Truth, The Business of News and the Fight for Facts. Thank you so much, Jill, for being with us today, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Claire. It's a real honor to be here. First of all, with you, my fabulous colleague in the English department, but also to welcome to Harvard three of the most distinguished, path-breaking and courageous journalists who cover the raging and forever changing tides of the Middle East. And we're going to begin hearing from them in just a minute. And we're going to begin with Robert Worth, who I know as Bobby, who was for many years my esteemed colleague at the New York Times. He, for several years, has been a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and is the author of pretty much every must-read piece that the Times Magazine publishes about the region. He has recently written about what is left of Aleppo. He's written other articles about Syria. He's the former Beirut bureau chief for the New York Times. Like me, he grew up in Manhattan, but for most of his career, he has been drawn to international coverage, and particularly the violence, foment, and hope of what is happening in the Middle East. So Bobby, or Robert, who has been a finalist for the National Magazine Award twice and is the author of a fantastic book Rage for Order, which you'll be able to buy. Please continue to introduce yourself and share your thoughts about the subject of today's program.
Jill, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to see you again and great to be part of this conversation. I'm going to, because I'm speaking first, I'm going to give kind of a tour d'horizon, a little overview of the Middle East. It's such a large and diverse region that I thought it would be helpful to do sort of rubrics, ways of looking at the Middle East, which I think will get us into the subjects that we'll pursue at greater depth later. So I've chosen three. One could certainly do others, but the first of these I take from our title, which is really about democracy movements in the Middle East and autocracy. And the big event here, of course, is the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, which is now having its 10th anniversary. It's hard for me to believe that it's been so long. I spent most of that year, 2011, chasing the events from country to country, and later, as you mentioned, wrote a book about it. When the Arab Spring started, many people in the Middle East and around the world had the feeling that a new Middle East was being born, that people were fed up with this stifling autocracy and the lack of freedom and the lack of economic opportunity, which was really caused by this stifling and terrible corruption in almost all of those Republican regimes. I'm talking about Syria, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. And of course, there were also protests in Bahrain, but the somewhat different there because it's a different kind of government. So it was a movement that attracted attention around the world. And as we all know, it largely failed in the sense that apart from Tunisia, which we'll get back to later, the movements were pretty much crushed by autocrats. And the worst outcome, as we all know, was the terrible civil war in Syria. And the hundreds of thousands who died there. But I think it's important to recognize that the story is not over. That there are still there's the younger generation who's not happy, with the status quo. And we had a sort of second round of uprisings, similar uprisings in Algeria in 2019. Those uprisings overthrew Bouteflika, the long-term president there. In Sudan, where the uprisings led to the ouster of Omar al-Bashir, the long-serving autocrat, and in Iraq also, although that wasn't really part of the Arab Spring, we had massive protests that led to the ouster of the prime minister there. Now, what happened, as we all know, subsequently was COVID-19, and that has really put a tremendous damper on any kind of street movements, unfortunately. But I think we will see a resurgence of those movements. It's really a generational change, I think, and it'll take a long time for those hopes to be realized. But I think the Arab uprisings in some form will continue. And I should add that some people believe among that younger generation and elsewhere that we're going to see cultural changes before we see substantial political changes in the structure of the family, for instance, that may be part of what ultimately changes. I should say also that the autocratic elements in the Middle East are not pure evil. It's tempting to see it that way from here, but some of the more traditional powers in the region, like Morocco, a monarchy, Saudi Arabia, and perhaps especially the United Arab Emirates, have been durable not just because of repression. There was repression, but those regimes had a certain kind of social legitimacy that was lacking for the nominal republics like Iraq and Syria, partly just because they're not practicing the same kind of hypocrisy. You know what you're getting from an autocracy like that, and in some cases they were able to provide actually a more substantial sort of opportunity for young people. I mean, for instance, the UAE is much lower on the Transparency International list of corrupt countries in the world. So that adds a kind of a different angle. Let me go now to the second category that I've chosen, which is political Islam and the role of Turkey. I put those together, political Islam and Turkey, because I think it's very hard to separate them for political and historical reasons. And I want to just remind the audience that really the most important historical background in looking at the Middle East today, I think, is not colonialism, European colonialism, which is very often talked about. It was a very, very big factor in the 20th century. Obviously, at the end of World War I, the map was redrawn. There was tremendous resentment about European colonialism. But after all, Turkish dynasties ruled the Middle East for hundreds of years. In fact, if you look at all the different dynasties, you could say the Turks ruled much of the Arab world for 1,000 years, which really had a much greater shaping effect on that part of the world than European colonialists did. And the Ottoman Empire, the latest incarnation of Turkish rule in the Middle East, lasted until World War I, when the Ottomans collapsed. What happened then in 1924, you had the assertion of a new and secular Turkish Republic, which dissolved the caliphate in 1924. Now that was an enormously significant move because the caliphate had been a kind of a symbolic center for Muslims around the world. And by collapsing it, the Turks generated a lot of anxiety. Many Muslims felt that they had lost something more than a pope figure, someone who could represent Islam. And so a few years later in Egypt, we had the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was trying to create an Islamist political movement. And that has been enormously significant. You've had branches of the Brotherhood and sort of similar movements based on the same idea all over the region. And they range from violent movements that we've heard an awful lot about for the past 20 years, like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, but also nonviolent movements like the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and its variants around the region. And those nonviolent movements have engaged in elections, have declared themselves to be democratic. It's hard to tell in some cases. Some of them are more democratic, in fact, and some less. But what happened in 2011 was that the forces that were, when you had this sudden overthrow of dictators, the people who were really able to stand up and fight for elections and to be organized about it were the Islamists. And they had a very powerful patron. And this is where Turkey comes back. In Erdogan, the president of Turkey. Turkey had been, as most of you probably know, a very secular republic, but with the rise of Erdogan, that changed. Erdogan is an Islamist and really saw the Arab uprisings as his great opportunity to reassert Turkish influence through these brotherhood-style movements around the region. Now that project mostly flopped, most dramatically in Egypt, where you had a democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, who was vigorously supported by Turkey, and then overthrown by the Egyptian military. But Turkey is continuing to press this project around, or I should say Erdogan is continuing to press this project all around the region. And in a way, you could see the contemporary Middle East as a kind of a containing this division between Turkey and its Islamist project and the enemies of that project, which are headquartered now in the Gulf, the Saudis, and particularly the United Arab Emirates, which is run by a very shrewd leader named Mohammed bin Zayed, who sees it as his project to fight back against the Islamist influence in the region. And that dynamic, that rivalry takes on, of course, all kinds of shades. It can look sectarian, it can look economic. I mean, we've had this big fight in the Eastern Mediterranean recently between Turkey and Greece, Cyprus, France, Egypt over offshore natural gas resources. The third dynamic I want to mention for looking at the region is sectarianism and Iran. And again, I think it's impossible to separate those two things. Everybody knows, I think on this call, that the split between Sunni and Shia in Iran dates back to the founding of the religion 1400 years ago, and that Shiites are the minority, represent about 10% of Muslims. But the modern point of departure is 1979, with the creation of the Islamic Republic in Iran. That created a new revolutionary form of Shiite Islam, which from the beginning was about exporting this revolution. That was terrifying to the great Sunni powers of the Arab world, particularly Saudi Arabia, which had its own claim to be the leader of the Muslim world as the host of the two great holy sites, Mecca and Medina. So you had this huge and very toxic rivalry starting in 1979, which proliferated across the Middle East in all kinds of ways. The first great battleground for that was the Lebanese Civil War, which had started in 1975, but which burned all through the 80s. And you saw a terrible new activated sort of sectarianism taking place there. One big part of that is Iran's creation of Hezbollah, the Shiite militant movement in Lebanon, which really is, in a sense, Iran's greatest triumph in its revolutionary project. And Hezbollah remains the most powerful military group in Lebanon. It really retains a huge grip on Lebanon, politically, economically, militarily. And for many of the younger protesters we've seen in Lebanon prior to COVID, Hezbollah was really a terrible obstacle. I'm going to wind down now as quickly as I can. Iraq also a terrible battleground for sectarianism ever since the 2003 invasion. And it's even spread sectarianism around the region to, for instance, Yemen, where there used to be almost no sectarian fighting, but where now that country has become a proxy battleground between Iran and Saudi Arabia, religious divisions that really were not very contentious at all in the past have been activated and turned sectarian. And as I said before, in all these places, sectarianism is mixed up with political and social and economic agendas. But it's nonetheless toxic for that. Okay, that's again a broad strokes introduction, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about all the different countries I've mentioned, but I want to turn it back over to Jill now.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that quick education and everything from the Arab Spring to Turkey's influence to the complexity of Iran. And now I would like to introduce Rania Abouzeid, who has 2 decades of experience covering the Middle East. Like Robert Worth and Alyssa Rubin, she is primarily known as a print journalist, but she is really, like most international correspondents these days, a multimedia journalist, and she's made a wonderful documentary about Syria. For her journalism, she's won 2 extremely important and prestigious awards, the George Polk Award and the Michael Kelly Award. Michael Kelly, of course, was a correspondent covering the Iraq War who unfortunately died doing that coverage, and this award is in his memory. And she is also the author of 2 wonderful books, one focused on women called Sisters at War, and another called No Turning Back. She is based in Beirut. She's born in New Zealand, grew up in Australia. Her parents are Lebanese. So with that, I turn you over to the wonderful Rania Abouzeid.
Thank you very much, Jill. And hello to everybody. Hello from Beirut, Lebanon, a place that is in deep pain. These are some of the darkest days since the end of the 1975 to 1990 Civil War. And it is a pain caused by the corruption, the mismanagement, and the arrogance of Lebanon's sectarian ruling class. Now, I thought that I would just give you a very brief overview and a view from the ground over here. So Lebanon today faces multiple crises. There's an economic crisis, there is political deadlock, There is a deterioration of the security situation, all while the country, and in particular the capital, deals with the aftermath of the massive August explosion last year, which just tore through a number of neighborhoods in Beirut, including mine. And superimposed on top of all of this is a raging pandemic that is nowhere near under control here in Lebanon. And the saddest thing is that every one of these crises was, you know, to a certain degree, it was avoidable. And they've happened because of the actions or the lack of action by the country's entrenched ruling class. To give you just a brief idea of the pervasive sort of attitude here in Lebanon, there is a graffiti sprayed on a wall not far from my home, and it sort of summarizes the sentiment. And it says, "The regime demands the fall of the people," a reversal of the slogan of the Arab uprisings, "The people demand the fall of the regime." Can you see me? I'm not sure. I can't see my video. Okay, great. Thank you.
We can see you.
Thank you. So in the past year and a half, the currency has collapsed. It has lost about 85 to 90% of its value. The banks have imposed informal and illegal capital controls, so they've prevented people from accessing rapidly depreciating money. We can only withdraw a certain amount per month. Meanwhile, at the same time, members of the ruling class have allegedly sent billions of their dollars overseas. So the brunt of this financial collapse is being borne by small depositors, by the dwindling middle class. So people can't access their money, while at the same time there is massive hyperinflation. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like on a daily basis, every time I go to the supermarket, which is about weekly, prices have gone up. I have a car, it's a small hatchback, and a few days ago I called the mechanic and asked him how much a regular oil change would cost. And the price he quoted me was the equivalent of the minimum monthly wage. And he told me that that was the price on that particular day, but depending on the black market dollar rate, it might be higher or lower the following day. He couldn't guarantee it. That's the type of uncertainty, that's the type of hyperinflation that Lebanese are living with. Now, just to give you the baseline, this was once a middle income country. Now, more than half of the population lives below the poverty line. So the fall has been rapid, it has been very painful, it has been shocking. The government, we've been without a government since the blast. The government resigned a few days after the August 4 explosion, and the bickering political class cannot agree to form a new government. Various leaders are still competing for positions, for portfolios. They are continuing as if it's business as usual, as if people aren't desperately trying to flee, as if there hasn't been a massive brain drain in the past year, as if desperation and so-called hunger crimes aren't skyrocketing, carjackings, home robberies. The Interior Minister, who is responsible for security in the country, recently said that the security situation is, quote, open to all possibilities, not just assassinations, God knows what. There is, because of the dollar crisis and the currency collapse, there is a shortage of medications. There are social media pages that have been set up to barter food, to barter used clothes, to sell anything of value. Fuel is rationed. Every pillar of the state has collapsed, and there are four main pillars that made Lebanon, Lebanon. The first is the financial sector. And the trust in banks is just non-existent. They essentially stole our deposits with no consequences to shareholders or bank owners who incidentally happen to be politicians or people who are tied to politicians. And I personally don't know a single person who is prepared to put another Lebanese lira into a bank. The education sector here was the best in the region. It is bleeding students who can no longer afford fees, and it's also bleeding teachers who can't afford to basically work for nothing, given the massive depreciation in their salaries. The medical sector. Lebanon was known as the hospital of the East. It has top-notch physicians and state-of-the-art facilities. Now, about 1,000 doctors and the same number of nurses have recently left the country. Now, in a state with a population of about 5.5 million Lebanese and about 1.5 million Syrian and Palestinian refugees, that is a big number. Lebanon per capita hosts the largest number of refugees, although strictly by the numbers, Turkey, the refugee population in Turkey is the largest in the world, almost 4 million people, 3.6 million of whom are Syrian refugees. The fourth pillar of the state is the tourism and service sector, the restaurants and bars that define a country that loves to live, that loves to socialize. Lebanon is a place today where the prevalent feeling is that today is better than tomorrow. Because tomorrow, the electricity cuts, there are daily electricity cuts and they're getting worse. So tomorrow the electricity cuts might be longer. The private generators that make up the shortfall in electricity might not be able to source their fuel. The subsidies on essential items, such as food items like rice and sugar, will be lifted, as well as the subsidies on petrol, on gas, doubling and tripling prices. Today is better than tomorrow because tomorrow bread prices might go up again. They've gone up about 4 times in less than a year. And the security situation, which is fragile at best, might deteriorate into clashes. Finally, they might blow us up again. There was a German company that surveyed the Beirut port after the explosion, and they found 52 containers of hazardous explosive material that the company basically described as a second makeshift bomb. So, the most basic function of a state is to protect its people. And I don't know a single Lebanese person today who has any confidence that the state will protect him or her. There is a red-hot rage against the ruling class, but at the same time, people are numb. They are worn out. They are just trying to survive, and they are bracing for what comes next. If we briefly look at the situation in neighboring Syria, after a decade of upheaval, of conflict, and of a devastating war that has killed an unknown number of people. I mean, the United Nations stopped counting Syria's dead back in mid-2013. And at that time, the figure was about 500,000 people. So this devastating conflict, the war is not over. It continues, although it is at a much reduced rate. Syria is a country divided into regime-controlled areas, which is most of the country, the northwest of the country bordering Turkey. The province of Idlib is in rebel hands. It is currently governed by Islamists. And then there is the northeast Kurdish-controlled areas. Now, the violent war continues, as I said, but today, the current war, the main war, is economic. Syria's economic crisis is also very deep and very debilitating, and it has been exacerbated by Western sanctions introduced last year that target members of the regime, of Bashar al-Assad's regime, but they are also more broad, and they effectively criminalize doing business with Syria, and that hurts every Syrian. So in Syria today, there are long bread lines outside of bakeries. Hunger and food insecurity in both Lebanon and Syria are real, but in Syria, 2/3 of people are food insecure. Half of the country has been displaced, either internally or externally, mainly to neighboring states, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and also further afield to Europe and elsewhere. The fuel shortages in Syria are so bad that people can wait all day in a queue at a gas station, and then they keep their cars there overnight so that they can resume their place in the queue the next day. So Syria is deeply impoverished, and people who survived the war are now struggling to survive this economic crisis and sanctions. And I think I will leave it there.
Thank you, Rania, for that very bracing but informative picture of both the crises in Lebanon and Syria. Now we will hear from Alyssa Rubin, one of the most experienced war correspondents working today. She has done signature journalism in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere in the Mideast. In 2016, she won the Pulitzer Prize for an amazing series of articles she wrote about women in Afghanistan, how their lives had somewhat improved, but continued to be extremely deprived of rights and challenged. The previous year, she won the John Chancellor Award, an award that recognizes a journalist for her entire career work, which was so well deserved. I'm going to make a small joke, which is that Alyssa began her career as an international correspondent in Topeka, Kansas. It's true that she once worked for the Topeka, Kansas Capital Journal before she came to Washington. She covered the Iraq War for the LA Times, and in 2007, I was able to help lure her away from the LA Times and help bring her to the New York Times, where she served with bravery and distinction as the Baghdad bureau chief and the Kabul bureau chief. She continues to be one of the foremost experts on life and politics in the Mideast. And I now give you Alyssa Rubin.
Thank you very much, Jill, for that too generous introduction. I'm always very happy to be anywhere with Bobby Worth and Rania Abouzeid, whose work is so admirable, and I really recommend reading some of their work because it is so deeply informative. I ended up by chance spending more time than I ever planned in Iraq, and so my vantage point is very centric to that country, but it serves as a helpful counterpoint, I think, to some of what Robert Worth was talking about, and to a somewhat different set of problems than Rania illuminated just now. It's important to think of Iraq in a way as having had a somewhat different path because of the US invasion. Its history in the 21st century took certainly a somewhat different route. The US invasion begins in 2003 with the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and that creates an entire dynamic, which then, as you know, leads to the sort of proliferation of a largely Sunni extremist movements that are linked pretty deeply to Al-Qaeda, and which ultimately morph one way or another into ISIS. But that means that Iraq really did not go through the Arab Spring, what was known as the Arab Spring in the 2011 period, along with other countries in the region. And it really fits much more into what Bobby was talking about happening much later in 2018 into 2019 and even 2020, but then subsided with COVID. So the U.S. invasion is, I think it's useful to think of it as having two important chapters. The first chapter is the one that goes from 2003 to roughly 2011 and was heavily resented in Iraq. Although it was initially the toppling of Saddam Hussein was welcomed by many, that was short-lived. And then it becomes very resented. And then once US troops leave, there's a period of some relief. And then as ISIS, the Islamic State, becomes more and more of a force in the region, in Syria, and also in Iraq, and then ultimately moves into Iraq in 2014, there's a call for the US to return, and it's quite complicated, but they returned, and there are troops there today. Very small numbers relative to the peak numbers of about 170,000 who were there in the 2007-2008 surge period. So that is a shaping aspect. The other big, and that put the US squarely in the middle of the region, not just in the Persian Gulf, not just operating from ships or from ports in the Persian Gulf or bases in the Persian Gulf and in Saudi, but really right in the middle. Then the other aspect of Iraq that I think is quite similar to the history and the current dilemma in much of the region, and this to some extent affects Lebanon, certainly affects to some extent Syria and elsewhere, is that Iraq is really a place where proxy conflicts and proxy power plays are constantly underway. So you have both Iran, which is Iraq's neighbor, and where Iraq is a plurality Shiite state. There's not been a census in years. No one knows exactly how many, but many Shiites there. Iran is, of course, Shia. And they are constantly making efforts to wield influence, I would say quite successful efforts in Iraq. So is the US, and the US has viewed Iran and continues to view Iran as a mortal enemy of Israel, which is a US ally, and also as an enemy of US interests. And so there is constant tension between those two countries that play out on Iraqi soil as recently as late February, when there was an attack on a international base, but where there are US troops in Kurdistan by believed to be Iranian-backed militias. At the same time, Turkey, which Bobby talked about, has enormous influence in Kurdistan, and has been a route for the Kurds to sell oil illegally. It's also has very close ties to the Kurdish government, as well as having some of its rebels, that is Turkish rebels, operating and taking shelter in the Kurdish part of Iraq. So you have three very large powers, the United States, Iran, and Turkey, all involved in attempting to pull strings and work the situation in Iraq to their advantage. Beyond that, and further complicating matters, is a similar corruption, although it has so far not affected people in the terribly dire way that the situation that the corruption has in Lebanon. But there is extremely entrenched corruption that, despite having a somewhat reformist government in Baghdad right now, seems all but impossible to eradicate. And that means that it's extremely difficult to actually make government work for people. And that remains something that is constantly an irksome part of government life. People do have enough to eat. They do have oil. Iraq is a major oil producer, but it does not really change the fact that to get anything done, people go around the normal recourses that ought to be available to them. It also means it is extremely difficult to move any business, to create any business that is not rooted in the state structure. So it's very hard to begin to build a middle class, which is ultimately what might make Iraq more sustainable. At the moment, it is a country entirely dependent on oil. So that is sort of the big picture right now. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit, because it's the way Iran does business in the region, it's the way it has worked considerably to some extent in Yemen, as well as, of course, in Lebanon. Yes, there is a Hezbollah, but there are many, many Iranian, some of them are actually militia groups, some of them have more or less active militias, but that they form political parties, they are active in the Iraqi parliament. So Iran has a political, it's the other side of the Islamist, it's the Shia face of the political Islam that we see at work in Iraq. And that has created enormous stress, made it with the US, obviously with Turkey, and with Saudi, which has some interest in beginning to make investments in Iraq. Much of the area that was terribly damaged during the fight with the Islamic State were the Sunni parts of Iraq, which has a long border with Saudi, but they are challenged and constantly aware of the competition with Iran, and that creates a further pulling apart of any possibility of creating a political structure that might actually work for Iraqis. So that's a bit of that tour de region, and I will turn it back over to Jill.
Thanks so much, Alyssa, for sharing all of that fantastic background on Iraq, a country you know so well, precisely because you spent more time there than you ever anticipated. Rania had briefly lost electricity, and I'm hoping that she can rejoin us, which I know she is hoping as well. But I'll begin just by asking, we're going to talk for a little while amongst ourselves and then turn to the audience questions, and just want to remind the audience that they both can and absolutely should buy and read Robert Worth and Rania Abouzeid's books, which are fantastic. And where I'd like to begin just among ourselves is with the region itself. I mean, something that made such an impression on me when I was both managing editor and executive editor of the Times is the magnetic pull that the Mideast has on almost every correspondent who has covered the region. And all three of you described, very serious and endemic problems in almost all of the countries of the Middle East. And yet, as I said, almost every Times correspondent that has covered the region is dying to go back during wartime, willing to take very serious risks to go back and cover countries like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. So rather than the beginning with the problems, which cannot be ignored, I'd love all of you have spent so much time in the region to share with us what is it about the Middle East that keeps drawing you back. And Rania, it's you know in your blood, obviously, but you know to do a play on your book. It seems to me there's constant turning back among journalists who cover the region. And what is it about the Middle East that calls to you and speaks to you and makes you so passionate about covering it?
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, Rania, why don't you're back? So why don't we take advantage of the fact that you're back and you hop in?
Thank you. Yes, I'm back. I have electricity after the generator kicked in. Thank you, Jill. It's an interesting question. I am of Lebanese heritage, so that is what draws me back to a region that I care deeply about. I remember the Lebanese Civil War, and I remember seeing my parents watch it from exile, and it was a very painful exile. It was the exile of the migrant who can't come home because of conflict. But despite that, we did actually make trips, childhood trips to Beirut during its civil war, because the thing about wars and places that are in conflict is that conflict happens in pockets, and it is quite rare that everywhere is on fire at the same time. And those childhood trips to Beirut taught me that there is life, there is abundant life, there is always life, even in the darkest times. And I'd say especially in the darkest times. I am drawn to a region that is the place of my heritage. As I said, I have family ties here. It's also a place of great despair, but also great generosity. I can't tell you the number of times that people in very dire situations, whether it's a refugee living in a tent who won't let you go past her tent without inviting you in for a cup of coffee, or people who are fleeing conflict who want to stop and ask you how you're doing. There is a tremendous generosity of spirit that is humbling, and it is always a privilege and an honor to be part of and to witness.
If I could,
Thank you so much. Bobby, jump in by all means.
I just wanted to say, Jill, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think maybe we, you know, this is a fault of ours as journalists. We don't convey clearly enough, you know, it's not all these catastrophes and nightmares. That, you know, one thing about the Middle East is large parts of it anyway are still traditional cultures where, you know, time seems to move more slowly, and there's more appreciation of ritual and family. And I mean, to give one example, Yemen, which, you know, looking at the headlines, you would imagine it's nothing but bombs and, you know, diseases and destruction and I mean, constant catastrophe and almost an apocalypse of a country. But when you actually get there, you know, it's such a pleasure to be there, because, you know, one of the great traditions of Yemen is spending almost the entire afternoon sitting and chewing cod and sipping tea and talking. It's the easiest place in the world to make friends. And people really treasure this social time. So, you know, it's just, there's a tremendous warmth and fun and laughter in those countries that, yeah, it's you know, we should try harder to convey that.
Alyssa, you can barely stay away from the region. So what is it that keeps pulling you back?
I think what really has kept pulling me back is that people are so courageous in the face of complete wreckage. And I, you know, it's some of what Bobby is talking about. It's having time for you, is what Rania is saying. You know, people are fleeing and they stop to ask you how you're doing. But it's also, I was up in Sinjar in the Yazidi area quite a while after they had been forced to flee, and very few people had been able to come back. And I went back with a family that was going back, and I said, well, why are you here? There was, there's no electricity, the water doesn't work, there's no hospital, they have 6 or 7 kids. It just seemed impossible. And he said, well, where else am I going to go? This is my home, and this mountain saved me, because they had fled through the mountain. I mean, they'd fled through the mountain, almost died, and you would think they would just want to escape from this place, but they felt linked to it and rooted. And I think as an American coming to the Middle East, that sense of roots is remarkable. And I'm used to people who move constantly, who've lived in 5 states. And here are people who actually feel a commitment to land, to village, to family, and are willing to fight for it. And I think their stories are worth telling. And they're sometimes very small stories, but they speak of something very large, and something that maybe we've forgotten in a more mobile and affluent world. So I think that's part of what keeps me going back.
And one of the great honors for me of serving in those senior editorial roles at the Times was being able to go to the region and visit with some of the correspondents and get to see the countries they covered through their eyes. Something else that I was heavily involved in was the Times's coverage of the Iraq War, which began when I was Washington bureau chief, and actually began on my birthday in 2003. And I must say, from the get-go, going back to President Bush's speech where he talked about an axis of evil, I had a definite sense that this war was not going to go well, and that it made little sense in terms of policy or objectives even. But it's actually turned out worse than even I could have imagined. And I wondered, from your points of view now, what you think the legacy of that war is, how it has affected the view of the United States in the region, and whether the destabilization related to that war can somehow be restabilized. And Alyssa, I'm going to call on you since you were there for so long, and then go round.
Three points come to mind. The first is one of the legacies of the war was that it vastly increased the power of Iran in the region. That was the unintended consequence that the US, one of many unintended consequences of the war, and it was one that the US has had to live with and now has been trying to undo in various ways that have not been particularly helpful for people in Iraq who happen to be Shia and who tend to be conflated often by the US with Iranians, not always, but sometimes, because they view Iran as an enemy. But that was a fundamental element of the war that was incomprehensible given the US antipathy to Iran, and even mentioning it as part of this axis of evil. As far as the US perception of the US, I think Rania will speak to that probably better than I will, but I would say it has damaged probably for most of the next century, the US image in the region, because so much went wrong. It was not only going in and reordering a country that had not asked for that, but there were civilian casualties, and it spawned a terrorist movement or augmented one that was nascent, however you want it. There are many ways of thinking about it, but nonetheless, it took off in that period. And I don't see a way that it can be put back together easily. And that is part of why I feel it's duty to keep covering it, because I think America owes something for the mess it created.
And that will keep going for quite some time. Rania, Alyssa kind of tipped it to you, so could you share your thoughts?
Sure. In terms of the legacy of the Iraq War and US standing in the region, well, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before the 2003 US invasion. There were a small group of Islamists in the north, but there was certainly no Al-Qaeda. And that obviously has had ripple effects in the region and indeed in the world. How can we forget the scandal of Abu Ghraib and what happened there, and the human rights abuses by a force that ostensibly, by a country that speaks about human rights. It was an invasion based on lies, and that won't soon be forgotten by Iraqis or by others in the region. Saddam Hussein was a US ally until he wasn't. He was a murderous tyrant. He was a brutal dictator when he was a US ally. And he was, also a brutal, murderous dictator when he fell out of America's favor. But the narrative, the US narrative on Saddam Hussein changed. An invasion that was based on lies, as I said, that claimed to want to bring democracy to Iraq. Well, what democracy? What it did was import, if you like, Lebanon's sectarian political system. It created a system where it divided parliament based on sect, where people were no longer Iraqis, they were Shia, or they were Sunni, or they were Christians. And while there was certainly that sectarian identity, it brought sectarian identities to the fore. And that is something which Iraq continues to grapple with to this day.
Bobby, one of the audience members has a question about sectarianism, and I wondered if I could fold it in to Iraq with you, which is to what extent, when we talk about sectarianism, are we talking about tribalism?
I mean, I suppose, you could look back at Islamic history back to Ali and see it in some way as a blood feud. People certainly have, but I fundamentally think of tribe as a different fault line. It's an important one in many, not all parts of the Middle East, but it can intersect with sect, but sometimes doesn't. I would just also say, tacking onto the last round of the last question about Iraq, I think Iraq 2003, in addition to all the terrible damage it inflicted on Iraq, I think it damaged US military credibility around the world in ways that ramified globally, and that we're still, suffering from. I tend to think also about Iraq as this sort of long-term tragedy in a Shakespearean way. If you look at Iraq in the 70s, it was a very hopeful place. Now, granted, what happened afterward was mostly to do with Saddam Hussein. I mean, he threw all that away. If Iraq had continued on the path it was going in the 70s, who knows what might have happened. There was at that time, yes, a very autocratic, but sort of fairly well-organized, oil-rich country that had tremendous educational achievements. Great institutions were being built, and it all came apart. And then 2003, we granted, Saddam had made a lot of damage before we got there, but we certainly made it worse. The one thing I would also say in that connection also is this: despite all the damage, I think I'm more hopeful now about Iraq's future than I am about Lebanon's future, which is a really sad thing to say about Lebanon. But you know, in Iraq, you have, as Alyssa mentioned, all of these different Shiite militias. You know, the Hashd, the Shabi, it's called, the Popular Mobilization Units. Some of them are directly backed by Iran, some of them indirectly. You know, it's a very messy picture. But what you don't have is a single entity like Hezbollah that is just immovable, a terrible obstacle to getting anything done in terms of reform. And in Iraq, you have in Mustafa Kadhimi, I think, a very smart and effective. I mean, you know, granted the challenges are vast, but you have some smart administrators, some people who he's brought on. So I feel some hope about Iraq, and increasingly feel less and less and less hope about Lebanon. Rania, I hate to say that.
It's true.
How about Syria? You know, Bobby, you wrote, I thought, just an amazingly good but crushingly sad piece about Aleppo, you know, which was a quite beautiful place. I had a student here at Harvard, actually, that was from there and showed us some before and after comparisons. But from your article, I could not derive a great deal of hope. But Syria and Lebanon were both great centers of learning with great universities. Will that ever come back? And has enrollment in the universities in those countries dived and sunk to, you know, almost negligible levels? One of our audience members was concerned with that.
Ronnie, do you want to do that? Or?
No, after you.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful history there of the American University of Beirut. I mean, there were these missionaries who came and founded colleges in Egypt and Lebanon and Turkey, and you know, they've left a wonderful legacy. AUB has had a lot of struggles. I mean, it's you know, people are not keen to send their children to study there in the way that they once were. Syria is a much sadder picture, and to me it just seems Syria is frozen now. I mean, it's as Rania explained, it's sort of parceled out into sort of a Turkish bit of Syria. There's a kind of a Kurdish bit of Syria. There's the jihadi bit of Syria. And in spite of the fact that Bashar controls most of the country, Syria, the government doesn't really control the borders. It's in this terrible state of poverty. But you know, who's going to fund Bashar al-Assad to rebuild? He's going to do it in the most vicious, revengeful way. And God knows, given the responsibility he has for all of that bloodshed, you know, why should we trust him? So I just don't see, you know, and the Chinese, I don't think are going to provide really that much. It's not really a good investment for them. The Russians have already sort of tapped out in terms of what they're willing to do in Syria. The Iranians don't have much money, especially with the sanctions. They retain a lot of influence there, but there's not much they can do in terms of rebuilding. So I just see a sort of a future of terrible penury and stasis in Syria. Lebanon is a little better because it still retains its international culture. But certainly that international culture has suffered a lot. And there's some people who look in the future at Lebanon, and they see the Christian population, which has already, you know, been leaving the country in droves, and even, you know, some of the Sunnis as well. They see that it turning slowly into kind of a, you know, a Hezbollah that is poor and a kind of a satellite of Iran. And that's a gloomy picture, but.
Yeah, I mean, I visited the American University in Beirut, which made me feel like immediately volunteering for a sabbatical year, but that was, you know, quite some years ago. Rania, did you want to add anything on the, you know, sort of?
No, it's they're dark days, like I said, and it's difficult to see a way out for both Lebanon and Syria at the moment. And I mean, every community in Lebanon is impoverished at the moment. Anybody who isn't part of the elite is in
Mhm.
really dire straits at the moment. And we're just, as I said, bracing for what we expect to be a worse tomorrow.
With things so unstable everywhere, it seems to me that the Middle East has never been a safe region for journalists, and it has been a veritable killing field for journalists going back to the beginning of this century. And the reason that I actually, was in Beirut was for the aftermath of the death of Anthony Shadid, one of the truly great Middle East correspondents who died coming out of Syria, the asthma attack, and many other international journalists have been killed covering the war in Syria. And Alyssa, you yourself were hurt very badly in a helicopter crash. And without, becoming overly nosy or personal, I just was so struck when you said to me as we were preparing for this panel that you want to go back and find out what happened to the other people who were packing into the helicopter trying to come off of Mount Sinjar that day. So do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Not at all. I feel like I was lucky. I was able to get good medical care and recover. And I'm very aware that the other people were, not everyone else, there were a variety of people on it, the helicopter, but the vast majority were very, very poor Yazidi refugees and fleeing ISIS, many of them would be left without members of their family who were killed or kidnapped and taken as sex slaves, essentially, or whatever we want to call them, women for the ISIS fighters. And I have gone back and found many of them, and I want to finish that and tell their story, because their story is the way more important one, because it's the real story of the country, and or of a part of the country, and a part of what it means to have had to suffer through the Islamic State, and that just getting them killing those jihadis or ending that chapter doesn't ever end the scars, and the scars go on for years. And I just think that that's a model, as Rania said, Abu Ghraib. I would add, all of the prisons that the U.S. had, where there's a lot of traffic here, where some of the Islamic State leaders were nurtured. I mean, this in a very short time, sort of, there were these shadows created that will continue to haunt the country. And so I sort of feel, since I saw them being created, I have a duty to write about people's efforts to live through them, and for a few survive them, but to remind people that this is what happens. Don't do things thoughtlessly. Think hard.
We have a question about the Kurdish people, particularly whether you have observations about how Turkey has treated the Kurds.
I'm willing to say a word or two. Well, this is a struggle that goes back a long way. The Kurdish people actually were in Anatolia, according to what I understand, prior to the Turkish people who came from Central Asia. And yet there was a strong effort by the Turkish state to assimilate them. They for a while, refused to call them Kurds. They wanted to call them Mountain Turks. And then there was this movement that started in the 1970s, the PKK in southeastern Turkey, that fought an insurgency against the Turkish state. So they're very much seen as terrorists. They do use violence, and there was an effort some years back by Erdogan, actually, who was more moderate in his discourse about the Kurdish issue than other Turkish politicians had been. There was an effort at a sort of a rapprochement. There were talks going on with the PKK. There was an effort especially to engage non-violent Kurdish groups in the southeast. But that fell apart largely because of what was happening in Syria, where you had really sort of a branch of the PKK. It has a different name, but it's essentially the same organization. And that organization was very effective at fighting ISIS. So they were the big American partner. We needed them to fight ISIS. That was the view of the Obama administration. And that infuriated the Turks, who didn't want anyone to be partnering up with, what they see as a terrorist group. And unfortunately, that pretty much destroyed any effort to reach a new rapprochement in the southeast of Turkey, which is a real shame because, I spent time in 2016 in southeastern Turkey in these towns where that are sort of people identify themselves culturally as Kurdish. And there's a range. Again, there's people who really sympathize with the militancy of the PKK and others who simply see themselves as wanting to restore the Kurdish language, but are very much, wanting a peaceful agreement. And sadly, many of those people I met with, non-violent people who served as mayors and administrators and so forth, most of them are in jail now. And the Turkish government has really hardened its line, which is a shame for all kinds of reasons. The Kurdish people, their existence in that part of the world dates back thousands of years. And I should say that the number of Kurds within the borders of Turkey, that's the largest group of Kurds. But as most of you probably know, there's Kurds also in Iraq and in Syria and in Iran. And the history is different in each of those 4 countries.
We have a provocative question, which I'll throw out, which is questioning our choice of words when we speak about the Middle East region. I'm going to read it. I wonder if you could please talk a little bit about your choice of word of Middle East to address the region rather than West Asia and Southwest Asia. I think this is a very important topic to discuss, especially when we are talking from our quote unquote West point of view.
Yeah, I mean, we're in the middle of what? And we're east of what exactly? But that's the way that this region is known. But it's a good question.
Alyssa, Bobby, want to weigh in, or I'll move on?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think it's another legacy of, colonial perspective on the Middle East. And there are a lot of people in the region who will, make clear that they don't like the term and say, we consider ourselves to be West Asia or what have you. Maybe there's another term even better than West Asia. I mean, it's such a vast region. It seems, a little funny to be tying, Beirut to, Siberia and southern China. I mean, it's also artificial.
Yeah. But like many historical things, manages to live on. Here's another question. Is it correct to affirm that the Middle East's regional enemy has shifted from Israel in the 20th century to the 21st century, that regional enemy for the East being Iran? And could you, if you agree with that, explain the main reasons?
I don't agree with it, and I don't think you can speak about the Middle East enemy. The Middle East is a very vast and diverse place. You have to look at individual countries and their policies with regard to Israel or Iran. There is an axis of countries in the region that are support Iran and that are part of the Iranian axis, and there are those that are part of the Saudi Gulf axis. So I think that you have to look at each country individually, but certainly the Palestinian question has not disappeared from the Middle East, not at all. It remains a core concern for people here, and you know, it hasn't disappeared.
Yeah.
I would just add that even just to take one step further, that within countries, there's also division, particularly in those countries where there's significantly different parties that are either in control or just there. And people perceive Iran and perceive, I would say people perceive Iran in many places as less of a threat than Israel. Israel feels very alien. I mean, Iranians, after all, are in the Gulf. People encounter them. Until very recently, there wouldn't have been a place where you would have met an
Israelis.
And so I think they remain an other at the very least. And I would think for most people, they would view them as potentially dangerous to their interests, to their safety.
Mm-hmm. We've glancingly sort of gone to Saudi Arabia in this talk, but since Tyrants is part of our symposium title, I wonder, is the three of you, what your take on MBS is, and whether at this point you think it's clear he has emerged as a very young tyrant, and is there any reason for optimism about his leadership as he moves to become more and more powerful in Saudi Arabia?
If it's okay, I'll just very briefly address the previous question and transition to that. I think unmistakably, one thing that's happened in the past 10 years is that the Gulf, which used to, defer on questions, certainly about Israel and politically generally, to Egypt, which after all was the sort of central, most populist Arab state. There's been a transfer of power to the Gulf, partly because all those other countries have been sort of more or less, wrecked by the consequences of the Arab uprisings. Whereas, with their oil and with their autocratic politics, the Emirates and the Saudis now have tried to present themselves as the dominant powers in the region, and their great fear is Iran. So I think they have been willing to sort of to have a rapprochement with the Israelis, and have really made it clear that they care much less. They've sort of lost patience with the Palestinian issue. I think it's, as Rania says, it remains in the public an important issue, but certainly the governments in those Sunni countries have essentially decided that they're fed up with the Palestinian problem or the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and they are now willing to make deals with Israel because they figure it's a useful partner against Iran. And that's certainly the calculus made by MBS and by MBZ, who's the Emirati leader.
Right.
I mean, my own feeling about MBS is that, I knew Jamal Khashoggi very well. We were friendly and spent a lot of time together. I mean, I was horrified by what happened there. And I continue to see him as a sort of dangerous character. But I think also you have to take into account something we don't often see in this country, which is that MBS is, despite everything, very popular with young Saudis. You know, they know what happened with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but many of them feel essentially, and I talk to these people, you know, that what MBS has done is to liberate them from an incredibly stifling way of life. He's really put a damper on the Wahhabi morality police that used to make life miserable for young Saudis. He's allowed entertainment to bloom in a way that it hadn't before, you know, movie theaters, all this kind of stuff. I mean, one of the elements of life in Saudi Arabia I thought was most important really in the past was crushing boredom, you know, and gender segregation. There was just, you know, your life was so constrained by the kind of religion that they practiced there. And MBS is changing that. So, you know, I'm not saying this should make us forgive, but I do think you have to take it into account. And I think the graphic nature of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the fact, you know, and what he's done to, you know, prisoners of conscience like Bujain al-Ahlul figured largely in our minds naturally because we read about it. But I think you also have to recognize that there's a larger picture there. I mean, I was a little surprised to see so many people saying that they thought, you know, the United States, the Biden administration should put personal sanctions on MBS. I thought that would be a bad idea because it's essentially regime change. You know, we would have been trying to oust MBS. I thought we'd learned our lesson about regime change. It's a dangerous policy, and no matter how much we dislike MBS, I don't think we should be getting into that kind of thing.
Alyssa, Rania, anything? I would just recommend to our audience that Alyssa and Robert's colleague Ben Hubbard wrote quite an interesting profile of MBS. I think it was in the Times Magazine, actually before the murder of Khashoggi. It captures sort of how cannily he played the different members of his family in order to pave the way for really what was an improbable rise, both his father and him. But alas, we have run out of our running room. The three of you were just terrific, and I'm sure many of us could go on listening for another hour at least, but we can't. And I want to remind the audience that as fascinating as it is to hear these three journalists talk, buy their books. Rania and Robert both are such skilled narrative writers, and you'll have many hours of reading pleasure. And Alyssa, I know there's a book in you still to come. So everybody, thank you so much for joining in this program. And Claire, thank you again for putting it together. And thank the Mahindra Center for convening us. And please visit the Mahindra Humanities Center website to learn about upcoming events. Bobby was talking about boredom in Saudi Arabia. The Mahindra Humanities Center has managed to occupy much of my time that would have otherwise been spent doing much more mundane things. So it's a great place with great programs. And thank the three of you for both today and for the fabulous work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.